It is my pleasure to welcome you to KEI for our academic paper series event today on prospects for the Rason Special Economic Zone. We are excited to have Andray Abrahamian, Executive Director at the Choson Exchange and a professor at the University of Ulsan, with us here today. In his paper, Mr. Abrahamian talks about a harmony of interests that is currently developing around Rason and its surrounding region. These interests make the developments, projects, the laws, the investment possibilities connected with Rason important to watch, especially as they pertain to a main question for Korea watchers: is North Korea really ready to reform its economy? The death of Kim Jong-il and the new leadership of Kim Jong-un only heighten the significance of the answer to this question on economic reform. Here to talk to us about his paper on the developments and prospects for Rason and to give his thoughts on what it all means is Andray Abrahamian. The first time I met Andray was in the Yanggakdo Hotel in Pyongyang, where I was a tourist, and Andray had just come back from trying to improve relations through the great game of Ultimate Frisbee. But when he's not playing Ultimate Frisbee, he's the executive director at Choson Exchange, a Singapore-based nonprofit focusing on educational training in economics, management, and finance for young North Koreans. He is also a professor at the University of Ulsan in South Korea. He has an MA in International Relations from the University of Sussex, and he is pursuing his PhD. Mr. Abrahamian has written extensively on North Korea issues. He also visited Rason last year, so we're pleased to have him write a paper for us on Rason and to have him here today with us to talk about it. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Andray Abrahamian.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for that introduction, Nick, and for KEI for inviting me and having me here this balmy and beautiful February in Washington, D.C. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this special economic zone in the far northeast of North Korea. I think it's going to be increasingly important to North Korea's economy and to the geopolitical relations in the region as a whole. Am I close enough to the mic? Do I make this? Okay, this doesn't work. This doesn't. Okay, things work. So to understand why the situation in Rason now is different to how it has been since its creation in 1991, we need to first look at North Korea's national narrative, their national story. We need to look at justifications for leadership in North Korea. We also need to look at the international context, Russia and especially China's interests, and how they all come together. So I've called this talk a confluence of interests because I think that is what we are seeing for the first time in Rason. I don't know if I can answer the bigger question that Nick posed about North Korean reform in general, but Rason has changed, and that is partly to do with point it here. Got it. It's partly to do with an increased focus in general on trade, investment, and economic growth in Pyongyang. To understand why this is happening, we need to think about their national narrative, which goes, I believe, something like this. So, socialist North Korea's march towards progress and harmony and all the good things they aspire to was rudely interrupted by the collapse of the Soviet Union and socialism in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. And as you all know, that decade was catastrophic for North Korea's economy. And also saw the rise of Songun, which is military first politics. And it's what Kim Jong-il came up with to firstly consolidate his power at the top and rule through the military as his primary institution, but also as a way to justify to his people why they were enduring such difficulties. The story goes, for North Koreans, we had no choice. With our allies gone and imperialists on our doorstep, we all had to sacrifice and suffer in order to protect our country. And the ultimate justification for that political ideology and the suffering is the nuclear weapons, which they tested in 2006 and 2009. Now, however, after that test in 2009, you've seen this increased focus on trade and investment in particular. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence to support this claim. First, if you look at the propaganda, there's been a significant shift since 2009. Kim Jong-il's on-the-spot guidances in 2009 shot up on the economic side at the expense of military visits. It was something like 58 to 33. And similar in 2010. Here he is in the bottom left looking at a CNC machine, which I'll perhaps talk about a bit more later. And, of course, that picture I'm sure you've all seen, his very last visit to a joint venture supermarket in Pyongyang. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Also, starting in 2009, the tenor of the joint editorial that you saw quality of life and light industry and even consumerism begin to be emphasized. That trend continued in 2010 and then in 2011 as well. This New Year's editorial was a little special. I think the trend probably would have continued had it not been for whatever happened late December. But we didn't get to see that editorial. We saw a quickly produced one that addressed issues of continuity between Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. This top poster references quality of life, and CNC is at the heart of this propaganda campaign to tell people that quality of life is now a primary issue for the government. This also popped up around 2009, 2010, and this sign was, according to longtime observers of Pyongyang, the first billboard that featured Roman letters. And what CNC is it's machine tooling technology. The North Koreans have come up with their own version, which apparently is quite good and cheaper than the rest of the world's. And the idea is that they're producing goods of a quality that they're producing goods to export, which will then be used to enrich people's quality of life. Okay. Around the transition period, late December, early January, you could see statements talking about Juche and the party, as opposed, well, not at the entire expense of statements talking about military continuity, but perhaps a slightly greater focus on the party and on Juche rather than military and Songun than we might have expected. I think this is good PowerPoint technique, right? Slap up a bunch of text, just block, yeah. So Rudiger Frank has a very good piece about it in 38 North recently. Statements related to the party have bureaucratic powers is not such that you can leap away from it. But I do think that there is a slow shift away. It's not like it's military second now. As I watched your live event here the week that Kim Jong-il died, there was a good chuckle about military second. Obviously, you'd never see such a phrase, but there is a gradual shift towards that. Also, in the last couple of years, you've seen some competition at the very top of North Korean society for control of trade and investment organs. There have been two main organizations that have been tasked with dealing with attracting and managing joint ventures and foreign investment. One is the JVIC, the Joint Venture and Investment Committee, and one is the Daepung Group, which is tied to the State Development Bank. These two organizations have different patrons. Daepung's higher-ups had closer relations with the military, and the JVIC had stronger connections to the party. We've speculated that Choson Exchange has speculated this represents a competition at the top, with elites recognizing that the future base of power comes with controlling FDI rather than military. Very interestingly, just in the last couple of weeks, there's been some movement at the top of these two organizations. Ri Chol, who was the head of JVIC and was the man responsible for bringing the Orascom telecom deal, he's moved away and has taken over something else. We don't know what yet. And a Daepung man has moved over to take charge of JVIC. Whether that represents kind of a harmonizing of interests at the top to avoid the dangers of unfettered competition, or whether it represents a loss for Daepung and we'll see that organization crumble, some kind of merger, or perhaps a takeover by military interests of the JVIC. We don't know yet. But things are still very active at the top in terms of controlling investment. You've seen a lot of continuity before and after Kim Jong-il. When Kim Il-sung died, as I'm sure most of you know, the country really locked down. Everything was shut down for an extended period of mourning. This was not the case in December. For example, when we got the news, the directors of Choson Exchange, we got on Skype, and we had a little chat, and we said, okay, we need to accept that all the work we've put into programs for next year may be wasted, things will get canceled and delayed, we can't be upset about it, that's the way it is. And we sent a letter to our partners offering some condolence and hopes that we could continue very quickly, within a couple days, which by North Korean email standards is very quickly. We got a response saying, of course, we're very sad at this time, but we need to continue. And that was a common experience for most foreign organizations, be it businesses or NGOs that deal with North Korea. The lines of communication remained open, and they wanted to emphasize the continuity of international interactions. Also, interestingly, I keep pointing at the screen. Doesn't seem to matter where I point. Okay, so there's been a transition. Have you heard? The first event after Kim Jong-un came to the fore was a mass rally in Pyongyang focused on economic issues, which I thought was significant. That phrase in Korean, "경공업 제일주의," translates very very nicely into light industry firstism. And the other slogans around all had to do with quality of life and economic growth for 2012. Of course, as you all know, real reform along the lines of the Vietnamese or Chinese model is significantly more difficult for the North Korean leadership than it is for those two countries. They have constraints that China and Vietnam didn't face. And you can really see this played out, especially in the 2000s, I think. There's a recognition that some kind of reform is necessary, but there's the fear that if it goes too far, it's the end of their country, the end of their society. As I mentioned, Rason was established in 1991. Nothing really happened in the 90s. There very, very little in the way of investment came in, or marginal growth, you could say. The laws were amended a few times, every few years, some kind of change, but nothing significant. Nationally, in 2002, there were major economic reforms. Everybody thought perhaps this was a good sign. There was a big trade law reform in 2004, which helped define international trade a little more clearly. Those all got rolled back in 2005, and there was a gradual creeping, sort of a gradual return to a bit more openness and freedom after that rollback, and then they tried to pull it all back with the currency reform of 2009. So I think you can really see their ambivalence towards reform in the last decade, and that ambivalence is expressed through special economic zones, a way to experiment with reform in a really controlled way. And North Korea has 3 of them. Rason and Kaesong are the 2 most important, but offer very different roles. The one up by Dandong, Hwanggeum-pyeong, I'm not sure what's going on up there. Not much, according to 38 North last week. It's a dumping ground for soil at the moment, and that's because largely the Chinese have little interest in developing it when compared with Rason, which I'll get to in a minute. Kaesong, I think, is a very interesting case because it shows that if you go in big enough, you can trap both yourselves and the North Koreans into an economic relationship that's very difficult to get out of. The South Korean government just published statistics last week saying that Kaesong had grown 14.4% in 2011 over 2010 levels. The population of workers has continued to expand. Works there, that means almost every family has some kind of relationship. The regional economy is absolutely dependent on that industrial zone. Rason is a different story entirely. It's the oldest economic zone, but it's seen very little in the way of large investment or growth. Concurrent with the broader shift in focus in North Korea in 2009, the changes in Rason started to happen as well. Kim Jong-il actually visited in 2009. That was his first trip to Rason, even though it had been around for 18 years. He thought it was time to go have a look. In 2010, there were a set of legal reforms just for Rason, which wrested it from Hamgyongbukdo, Hamgyong province, and gave it more legal autonomy. There's now more locally made decisions taken in Rason, and South Korean businesses are now legally allowed to participate in Rason. That right had been removed in 1999 with some legal changes, so that's now back as well. They reformed the tax rate. 14%, which is the same as Kaesong, 10% for targeted industries like computer chips and other things that no one's going to invest in. And they set a minimum wage at about $80 per month, which is actually higher than Kaesong, which is like $63 or $65. Also, I'm not exactly sure when this started, but I'm guessing it's also around 2009, 2010. The quality of the administrators being sent up to Rason seemed to get better. Now it's really seen not as a place of exile, which it might have been in the 90s, but it's a place where talented people can go and make a career for themselves. One guy told us, absolutely, my career depends on how well I can attract foreign direct investment. The vice mayor, who, if you read the news, you might have seen, he took the journalists on that strange little cruise down the coast. And he's a very impressive man. He spent a lot of time abroad and is fluent in English. Many of the top and even mid-level people in Rason have spent time abroad and speak foreign languages as well. I happened to go in August, which was when the Rason International Trade Exhibition took place. There were over 200 companies exhibiting, and this was actually the first trade fair to take place outside, international trade fair to take place outside of Pyongyang. Toured some factories. That is a shoe factory on the right. An American that was there suggested that was about 30% cheaper to make shoes in Rason than across the border in Jilin. What's really significant is the road is finally being built. If you can imagine, special economic zones need three things. They need a water supply, they need a good transportation network, and they need a good power supply. Water, I guess, has never been a problem in Rason, but for 20 years, there's not been a paved road leading from the Chinese border down to the port, which, I mean, if you need a clearer sign of ambivalence or disinterest, I don't think you'll find one. But this is finally starting to be addressed. They started work on this in April, May of last year, and we're racing to finish it before the winter hit. They didn't manage that, so now the plan is to come back next month and finish the road by the summer. North Korea is a place where there's always news coming out about agreements and MOUs and understandings and plans. Rason's no exception to this. This is something concrete that's actually taking place. So I think it's hard to overstate the significance of it. This was how it looked in August. There's a sign in both Chinese and Korean which says, "Let's strengthen the Korea-China friendship through construction of the road." Catchy. That's how it looked in November. And people now are saying it's 60 to 70% done, depending on who you ask. I heard one person tell me 90. That seems like an outlier. Keep pointing it at the screen. The port has seen some changes. A Chinese company leased. There's three ports actually in Rason. The main one is Rajin Port, and it has 3 piers. A Chinese company has leased the first pier for 10 years. That started in 2008. The third pier has been leased by a Russian group for 49 years. And similar to Kaesong in a way, if you go in big, I think. And the way they structured it is they will, for a promise of $1 billion investment in that pier, they get all the port fees for 17 years. And then for the remainder of the contract, they split it 70-30 with the Koreans. You can see that pier has some bigger, more modern cranes than the others. Just last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, news came out that China and North Korea signed an agreement to invest very heavily in Rason, especially the port. Again, this is just news coming from an unnamed source, probably one unnamed source. That's South Korean media style. But that seems congruous with China's plans for Rason. That deal, something like $3 billion, they claim. They're going to build 3 more piers and, again, have the lease for 50 years. When I talked to the port manager last summer, the plan was to build 2 more piers. The depth he talked about was 15 meters, which is significant because at that depth you can have almost the biggest ships in the world, super post-Panamax. And that will allow economies of scale for exporting even across to the Americas, certainly to Japan and Southeast Asia. Also, in November, it was reported that a deal had been struck actually construction had begun on a system to bring power in from Jilin. Initially, I think the North Koreans wanted the Chinese to build a power station. Some changes have happened in terms of banking, which is still very underdeveloped. This sign was at the border in December. And talks about how banking services for international trade are now available through China Construction Bank. I don't know if you can see that at the bottom. They're also building a 7-story headquarters for Golden Triangle Bank, which is a DPRK bank, and that's going to facilitate international transactions as well. I heard stories of cash having to be driven up from Pyongyang at some points in order to conduct deals. And that's a long way. So having modern banking facilities is obviously going to be important as well. Okay, so why is all this happening now? And for that, we need to take a look at the international context. Okay, so in 1991, around the time that Rason was founded and the world was changing significantly, the UN decided to get involved. The UNDP came up with a Tumen River Development Program. And this was a very ambitious 20-year, $30 billion plan that covered a huge area and was going to integrate and develop various industries. I mean, you can see from the map all the way up into Mongolia, stretching into central China, including South Korea and Eastern Russia. Just terribly ambitious and lacking in anything you need to make it a reality. I think it's fair to say that the Tumen River Development Plan was an abject failure, as its successor has been as well. In 2005, it was rebranded as the GTI, the Greater Tumen Initiative, ostensibly to address the key problem that it faced, which is that none of the participants had ownership or cared to have ownership of this project. So high-level officials wouldn't participate in meeting, again in English. That's the kind of organization I think it is. Their website looks like it's hosted by GeoCities, I don't know how to say that, in the mid-90s. The date says, yesterday it said January 23, 112, which is off by 1900, I believe, 100 years. So it hasn't been able to live up to its own ambitious plans. It still the GTI still continues to make slightly less ambitious but equally vague plans, like to increase trans-border trade by 10 to 15% before 2015, but without any mechanisms to do that. Now something is different, however, and the difference is that China has come up with a development plan for Jilin province that it fully owns. I wonder if... okay. And it's called the Changji 2 plan. Changji 2 is an abbreviation of Changchun, Jilin, and Tumen, which are these three cities. It's a very ambitious plan, but it's ambitious in like a Chinese development context where they're very serious about accomplishing the goals they've set out. The project includes infrastructure, including trains, motorways. That region is now crisscrossed by brand new highways. There's high-speed rail between the two bigger cities, Changchun and Jilin. They plan on extending it to Tumen. The plan also includes financial institutions, development of banks and holding companies, industries like autos and biotechnology, agriculture, electronics, and they plan on doubling the 2008 GDP of Jilin province by 2012, and then quadrupling it by 2020. This plan absolutely does not work without Rason. Rason is key to this and has been from the very beginning. Just last year, they did a test run of coal from a Hunchun-based coal mining company through Rason down to Shanghai Pudong Port, and it took 3 days. And apparently, usually that amount of coal to travel down to Shanghai takes 11 days. This was before the road was paved as well. So Rason opens up for landlocked Jilin the prospect of exporting not only internationally but domestically. That doesn't make sense, export domestically. But an international route through which to ship goods to their domestic market. The Where are my notes? Yeah, so after a long history of rumored development agreements, MOUs, this plan is really harnessing Rason's potential, I believe, and will continue to do so in the coming years. You may think this assessment has been quite rosy, so it would be remiss of me to not mention that there are still a myriad of challenges. Infrastructure has a long way to go. Banking, as I mentioned, has a long way to go. Telecommunications remains very difficult. Rason administrators don't have their own individual email addresses yet. There's a mobile network for foreigners that's separate from the mobile network for locals, so they can't call each other. International calling is difficult. Those are things that a special economic zone will need to address. And there are plans to get email addresses starting this year, or so I was told. And then, of course, the issue of legal reform. There's a big difference between having the laws on the books and then applying them consistently and fairly. And that's something that Rason will need to demonstrate that they're willing to do if they're going to attract investment from beyond Jilin province. One thing our nonprofit Choson Exchange does is educational exchange, focusing on law and economic management and policy issues with the North Koreans, and it's Singapore-based. So the Singaporeans are always, I don't want to say harping on, but the consistent message is we are successful because everybody knows when they come to Singapore, they'll get the same rules as the next guy. So it'll be important for Rason's administrators to be able to demonstrate that commitment as well. And then, of course, finally, it is a part of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And as we've seen from the 2000s, there's a history of rolling back changes that have been made. And with a shift in political winds, that is always a possibility as well. I should... wanted to mention the name of the organization I work with. Please check us out online on Twitter, and feel free to email me at an email address you can get off me afterwards. And we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll take questions.
All right. Thanks, Andray. Appreciate that. We'll take some questions. We have a microphone, so raise your hand and name an organization. And we'll get right to you. Right here in the front, please. The microphone right here for you.
Bob King, State Department. Question I have is, what is the impact of the Chinese investment in Rason on DPRK? One of the problems with Chinese investment in a lot of places is the Chinese will go in, they tend to bring in Chinese workers, and their impact locally tends to be much less. Is that happening in Rason as well? Do you basically have Chinese workers coming in doing work? The port facilities that are being built are intended to be used not publicly but for Chinese use. Is this having any serious development impact on North Korea?
Do you one or two? Or, on the Korean Peninsula this year, and up there, unimaginably so. As to whether or not it impacts the DPRK more broadly, the special economic zone is made to contain developments, but there are always inputs and outputs that spill out over the borders of these zones. China's consulate, for example, is in Chongjin, a few hours' drive down the road, so there's going to be administrators going back and forth as Chinese investment increases, and goods as well will also come in and out. So there will be some, I think, regional impact, though probably quite marginal.
Are there other questions? Yeah, right here in the front.
McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. There's another person named Andray, spells his name differently, Lonkov, I suspect you know. It's been a couple of years since I read his foreign affairs article on that. I wonder what you think of the ideas he presented. And I also wonder, with respect to what the Chinese goals are, I remember when I first broached this subject with the Chinese, they had a long-term plan. This was probably 15 years ago, in saying what we want is a rejuvenated North Korean economy with a spin-off for the Rust Belt of Jilin province and so forth. It seems to me you said some things along that same line that kind of validate what was said so long ago. Could you comment on those, Andray?
Sure. I think the image we often see in the media is of North Korean officials, of Kim Jong-il going to China hat in hand saying, give us stuff. But I think it's probably more accurate to say that on those trips the Chinese are saying, hey, check out what we're doing. You could do something similar. And what's different now is that for the first time I think we see North Korean acquiescence to major Chinese investment in this zone, even though they've been pushing it for several years. As for Lankov's article, I don't recall exactly which one that is. That man is so prolific. They kind of merge. He's
transformed North Korea.
Yeah. Well, in general, he tends to be pro-economic engagement, which I am as well. Generally, he also is well aware that North Korean elites are constrained by the successful neighbor to their south, and so it'll be interesting to see how they resolve that tension in the next couple of years, because they do have a very fine line to ride between some degree of reform and the danger of their system collapsing.
Other ones, Dr. Cronin, right here.
Patrick Cronin from the Center for New American Security. Thank you very much, Andray, for this presentation. Very opaque business, so I would still seek your clarification, though, on some of the investment numbers you cited. The Chinese, we've seen public reports, increase their investment in Rason from $2 billion to $3 billion. Maybe that's from 2 to 3 ports, perhaps, if we want to use broad numbers. But there's also been talk about a $10 billion investment fund, and I wonder if you can clarify what you've heard about other money that's waiting to be invested, and could also shed any insight into the Russian investment here, especially the train, that I think is maybe a significant part of the transportation network that could create quite a transportation hub in the region.
Yeah, thank you. I've also heard about that $10 billion investment plan. Again, as you mentioned, it is opaque, and all these agreements and understandings, until roads and cranes and power stations are being built, they have to be taken with a grain of salt. I wish I could do better than that. The train line to Russia was completed in the fall, and they had an opening ceremony for it. It was a fairly expensive project. Forget the number, it might have been $1 billion, but Russian train gauges are different to the world standard, which North Korea is actually on. So what they did was they widened the tracks in North Korea so trains could go directly to the port, and they're looking at shipping coal through the port. I don't know if that's happening regularly yet.
Again, here in the front.
Gordon, I have no affiliation. I participated in this UNDP negotiations back in the early 90s. I think, as I recall, the program at that time, maybe it expanded later on, was certainly not as ambitious as you mentioned it. It was concentrated very much on North Korea and its immediate neighbor, China and Russia. I would offer a different sort of a narrative about what happened. It seems to me in 1994, when Kim Il-sung died, negotiations stopped right then and there. And my guess would be that Kim Jong-il was the major obstacle to any further improvement during this entire time. And the only, perhaps, explanation for the change is that after trying to overturn reform several times, the latest of which was the 2009 currency reform, maybe finally came to the conclusion that it was inevitable that some reform had to take place because the old system wasn't working. I think that more important than anything else as far as external atmosphere, it was the initiator of change in the situation, because I would think that others, the Chinese and others, and maybe even the South Koreans, would have been certainly much more responsive if they'd ever seen any real commitment on Kim Jong-il's part. And as you know, the Chinese time over and over again try to get Kim Jong-il to undertake a Chinese-style economic policy, and he's never been able to do it. So this is just the first very small step.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Definitely, I agree that that's part of the story. The Greater Tumen Initiative, the rebranding of the project, actually doesn't officially include the DPRK as one of the member states. But it's not just the North Koreans that were disinterested in this program. For example, in 2009, the GTI helped organize a ferry run that was going to link China, Hunchun, down to South Korea, across to Japan, and then up to Russia, and various other admin things. That it only ran 5 times, and then it stopped. So I don't think it's fair to lay it entirely on North Korea. The Chinese also have been suspicious of it. And then back in the 90s, of course, the capacity of all these countries to act was far lower as well. China's not the country it is today. Japan was starting its long recession. 97, Korea was hit with a huge financial crisis. So, the conditions in all of these countries was not favorable to the UNDP's project being successfully carried out, I think.
Yeah, Dr.
Thanks very much, Andray. I can see how, it's clear how Rason is important to Jilin province. But what's the reasoning from the Russian side? How is Rason an improvement over using Vladivostok, for example, to ship coal?
Yeah, thanks. I should have mentioned that in the talk. The main quality that Rason has that the Russian ports in the region do not is that it's ice free throughout the winter. Although even with this unseasonably cold winter, I haven't heard of any ice in that port. Though there were reports of North Korean ports on the other coast, the west coast, freezing up, which is apparently unprecedented. That didn't happen in Rason even over this winter. Yeah.
All the way in the back. Dr. Merrill.
Very nice presentation, Andray. Thank you. I'd just like to do a footnote to the comment that was just made. I think I would agree with your interpretation that Kim Jong-il was of 2 minds with regards to economic reform. And I forget the specific years, but there was a reform-minded premier, Park Bong-ju, for a spell of about 2.5 years. And a PhD student at Cornell, I think, did a content analysis of Kyungjae Yonggu. And so this is not my interpretation, but in the North Korean Economic Journal, suddenly there appeared a burst of articles that were kind of didactic in explaining how other economies work. So it was real for a brief period of time, and then they did backtrack on it for the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we're seeing that same kind of energy now. Again, a rumor, an anonymous source from last week told, was it the Dongailbo, Choson that since Kim Jong-un took over, they've sent 1,000 officials to China, to various cities to study economic management issues. I don't know if it's true, but one hopes so.
Again in the back, all the way in the back.
Thank Thank you, Andray, for your excellent presentation. My name is Han Koo Young, and I'm working at the World Bank, and I had worked in the Korean government, kind of negotiating free trade agreement. I'm wondering whether you have considered this Korea-China free trade agreement negotiation factor in this future development of Rason special economic zone. You mentioned that the Korean companies are less interested in this Rason. And I think one of the ways to boost South Korean companies' interest is to, include this Rason zone in the ongoing, the free trade negotiation with China, between China and Korea. You may remember that in Korea-U.S. free FTA negotiation, this Kaesong Industrial Complex, how to, expand the benefit of free trade agreement to. Kaesong has been one of the hottest topics between two countries. And when I met with the companies in Kaesong Industrial Complex, their main interest on whether they would invest in the future or not is really hinged on whether the free trade agreement would include the exception to the rules of origin to those products from Kaesong Industrial Complex. So if I understand that the Korean government is trying to negotiate with the Chinese on including this Rason special economic zone, to the benefit of the free trade agreement. I don't know how the Chinese would. I don't know whether Chinese would accept or not. Maybe it could really help, the development of the zone, and also which could lead to kind of spillover effect to, Jilin. But on the other hand, more Korean companies would flooding in, which could create some rivalry, between, the Chinese and Korean companies. So I'm wondering whether your insight on this, future prospect of this Korea-China FTA in this Rason economic zone.
Well, I'm quite sure I don't know as much about the prospects for the Korea-China FTA as you do, but I imagine that going forward, there's a decent chance that the North Koreans would like to see South Korean businesses involved in Rason, because right now it's almost exclusively a Chinese venture. And the North Koreans know that it's not in their interest to have the power supply controlled by China. They know it's not really in their interest to have to give up 50-year leases on ports, on piers rather. So perhaps as the political winds change in South Korea, the prospects for participation in Rason will increase. I hope they do. Again, though, the risk for a South Korean company is going to be greater because their government doesn't hold the hedges, doesn't hold the leverage like Beijing and Jilin are. As for the Korea-U.S. FTA, I'm used to calling it the Chorus FTA. I like the vagueness of the language concerning Kaesong. I think in the future it might give the United States a way to, it might give them something to offer the North Koreans. The U.S. has very little to offer in some ways. So I don't want to use the word carrot, so I won't. But it is something that could be offered in the future if relations improve.
What else? I mean, you talked about the laws that North Korea made for Rason for.
It's hard to know how much it would take to make South Korean companies feel comfortable with a major investment in Rason. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, right here in the. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is. I'm sorry. Excuse me. My name is Sung Hee-na. I'm retired from the World Bank. Thanks for your presentation. I have a short comment and a short question. The comment is about all this talks about investments by China. I think there's a great deal of inflation in those numbers, and because as usual, there's always this intention for invest and all of those things, and also the investments that Chinese would make, I don't think will be cash into North Korea. I think the big chunk of those numbers that are being talked about will be in the form of some machinery that the Chinese will bring in and use them and eventually take them back. And so I don't think, we should kind of have this unrealistic understanding that there will be all these billions of dollars in cash that will be pouring into North Korea. I think the reality will be very different. My question is about when you visited Rason, did you hear from those North Korean officials any talk about any strategy on how they think that, how they are planning to develop this area? Is it going to be primarily the light industry, light manufacturing industry that they're trying to attract the Chinese companies to come in and create all this employment? Or is it going to be primarily just as a throughway for the exports from China, through these port facilities? And if they're talking about allowing South Korean companies coming to Rason, it's a long way from the south, and there has to be really a special reason for the South Korean companies to go all the way up there and go through all this training and those difficult times to set up the manufacturing facilities. And what would be the kind of strategy, if there was any talk, of attracting a particular party, if they have any such a strategy? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the comment and the question. I don't think we're going to see huge Chinese industrial complexes being built there in terms of manufacturing. For a long time to come, it's just going to be a place to assemble textiles. Its main value to the Chinese is as a thoroughfare, which is why I think that the big chunks of money will go to that transportation network, so that landlocked Jilin can export through it. In terms of a strategy, obviously they would love to attract higher value added industries, but they know that is not realistic in the near or medium term. So I think they hope the administrators there are quite pragmatic. They well understand their place in the region and the world, and I think the hope is to normalize some of the functions in terms of telecommunications and transportation infrastructure, and gradually grow as a transportation hub and as a place to assemble shoes and shirts and whatnot.
I'm waiting again.
Andray, I wonder if there's any tension about the fact that China doesn't have access to the sea there. Is that something that people even talk about anymore?
What people?
Well, that's
yeah.
Run the spectrum.
I've never really talked about it, with anybody. It's just a fact that I think China has accepted for the time being, at least. Despite its growing strength, Beijing still doesn't want to pick a fight over a 170-year-old border that they got screwed into when they were weak in the 19th century. So, in a way, it's hard to imagine, business in the DPRK is the easy option, but it is the easier option for them for resolving this border problem they have.
With kind of like you're talking about the Chinese investment and these type of issues, does China want Rason to work more than North Korea does?
I think that has been the case historically, but now, as I mentioned, there really is, I think, a harmony of interests where the pushing by Beijing is now being accepted.
Yeah. Yep. Go right here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Andrew Abrahamian from SEZs, Johns Hopkins. I think it was a great presentation, and you did a really good job of delineating how the state interests are kind of guiding this process of economic development. But do you have any idea of how North Korean or Chinese entrepreneurs or maybe state-owned corporations are able to exert pressure on policy, or maybe just acting first and then having policy created around them?
Yeah, that's a good question and difficult to answer. The Changjitu plan is a regional plan, but Beijing and Jilin governments have worked very closely together to develop it and make it happen. As for entrepreneurs and state-owned enterprises and their role, I think that will be an interesting bellwether in the next few years. If you see bigger companies moving in, I think that's probably a sign that they feel their government has enough levers to secure their investment. There are big firms involved in Rason, like the Changli Group, which is a big construction conglomerate, or Jilin Tobacco, which is a huge tobacco company, but their operations are small. So if we start seeing bigger SOEs with bigger projects, I think we'll have a better answer to that question in the coming years.
And then right behind.
Delegation came in their fancy cars and strutting around like they owned the place. And the Korean, the staff, the workers there, who didn't realize that I understood Korean, were very frank, saying things like "Chunum They were very resentful.
My burning ears.
We've come ahead more than 15 years now, and the gap between Jilin and Hamgyongbukdo is much, much larger. And I can't imagine that feeling of resentment is any less than it's always been. Do you see any of that? Or hear any of it?
I think I might have to respectfully disagree, or not disagree, but I think maybe it's changed. From people I've talked to, attitudes towards foreigners in general have become much better over the last few years as people have gained comfort with the idea of foreigners being in their town and having sort of just day-to-day interactions with them, which I think is a very positive development. Yeah.
Right in the front.
Hi, my name is Ji-hee Choi. Thank you very much for your talk. It's always great to hear more information about what's going on inside the country. My question is about trying to relate North Korean sort of propaganda or strategy about improving standards of living, and then this desire to develop Rason. Have you heard, do you get the sense that North Korean officials have a strategy of how the development in this area is going to impact or improve the standards of living of North Korean people? I mean, are they using specific metrics, either in their propaganda, or, do people even have a sense of if this area develops eventually in the other parts of the country, we're also going to see X, Y, and Z, whether or not it's realistic or it's just a big dream, but is there a strategy going on?
Yeah, did you say specific metrics? No. There aren't. And seeing the link between this broader propaganda push and the development of Rason it's more of a conceptual one than anything else. It's that's all I got.
Chris,
sorry.
Thank you for your talk, Andray. Very interesting. You mentioned briefly the Rason's tax rate and minimum wage rate. I was wondering if while you were there, you got any information on the business registration process or any work the North Koreans were doing on dispute resolution or profit repatriation policies.
I didn't. Actually, when I was there, it was a buzz with activity, and people had very little time to spare. That trade fair was going on, and the Economic Cooperation Bureau, which is almost the same as the city government, overlapping at any rate, was stretched very thin. So I didn't get to have all the conversations I would have liked. In terms of dispute resolution, that's addressed in a national legal revision that took place in 2010. And it's also addressed in vague terms in the Rason legal code, which I have with me if you want to take a peek afterwards. It's a thin book. Again, the main difference is having it on paper and applying it consistently, and that's, I guess, what we have to look forward in the future. In terms of repatriation of profits, again, it's covered in. I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me like fairly vague terms in this legal code for Rason. And as I said, banking mechanisms are just now being set up so that currency transfers can take place smoothly. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep. Sarah in the back.
Sarah from KEI. Do you see a role for the United States in this process, specifically Rason, and also just for overall economic development in North Korea at this point?
That's a good question. I don't for Rason specifically, and even more broadly, it's tough. I mean, the United States is trapped by this relationship as the North Koreans are, where perceived interests override or constrain actions. I think the potential to engage with Kaesong economically is much greater than Rason, because Rason is so much less stable. Kaesong is established and runs smoothly. Rason is still in a situation of flux, and it's hard to imagine certainly the American government getting involved in any way. There are Americans who do business in Rason. There are a few small firms that do some textile assembly and export and other things. And I would like to see that kind of work not discouraged. Some of the stories you hear are of Western firms that are going into North Korea to conduct business that is legal, that's not restricted by sanctions, but then come under informal pressures from various governments. And I think if that were to cease, the prospects for Rason would increase, and stability in the DPRK in general would increase as well. Thanks.
Any other questions? Well, with that, I want to thank you all for coming. We had a great discussion, great ideas, and great information on what's going on in Rason. Our next APS event is April 18th. We have Dr. Elizabeth Steffen from Georgetown coming in to talk about the future demographic challenges of South Korea. But right now, I want you to please join me in thanking Andray for his great presentation. Thank you all, everyone.
Thanks very much.